So Camilla apparently collapsed the moment the Privy Council made it official. And honestly, the part everyone keeps skipping over is that the documents had already been signed days before she even walked into that room. That's the detail that makes the whole palace statement feel like a cover for something much messier. Because if this was just a routine constitutional formality, nobody collapses, nobody freezes, nobody has to be helped out of a private council chamber while Charles simply sits there watching. And William didn't celebrate. He gripped the edge of the table, held his breath, and turned toward his father like he'd just been handed something he wasn't supposed to open yet. That image alone tells you this wasn't a ceremony. It was a rupture. The official framing was that the Privy Council formally acknowledged William's accession as part of a planned transition. But the same accounts describing Camilla's collapse also claimed that the monarch's signature on a preliminary transfer document was dated several days before the announcement. That means Charles had already initiated the process while Camilla still believed there was room to argue. She thought she was walking into a discussion. She was actually walking into the aftermath of a decision that had already been made behind her back. And when she realized that, her legs gave out. Not because of William's title itself, but because she understood that the one person she thought she could still influence had quietly removed her from the equation. 6 days before the Privy Council announcement, Camilla reportedly had a private meeting with Charles at Windsor. She asked him to delay the transfer for another year. Her argument was that moving power too soon would weaken the older monarch before he was emotionally prepared to step back. But Charles didn't argue. He listened. Then he closed the folder she had been using to debate him and told her the transition could no longer be handled as a family matter. That night, he contacted the authorities responsible for beginning the council process. The documents were prepared by the following morning. So, when Camilla entered that council chamber, she was already defeated. The signature was days old. The machinery had already turned. And the only person who apparently didn't know was Camilla herself. That's why the collapse was so significant. It wasn't necessarily theatrical. It was the physical response of someone realizing she had lost access to the most important decision of her husband's reign. And the coldest part was Charles's reaction. He set his pen down. He watched William. He absorbed the weight of the moment, and he allowed Camilla to be escorted out. That's not the reaction of a man who has just been caught off guard. It's the reaction of someone who had already made peace with what was about to happen. But William had not been given the final date either. He knew the transition was coming. He simply didn't know the announcement would happen that morning. Charles had deliberately kept his son out of the final scheduling conversation. The reason, according to the story, was to protect William from accusations that he had orchestrated his father's departure behind closed doors. Charles wanted the record to show that the decision was his alone, noble in theory. But it also meant William walked into that room carrying the same uncertainty as everyone else, except the crown landed on his head before he had time to prepare emotionally. And when William finally spoke, he didn't ask about his new authority. He asked his father if he was certain. Charles didn't answer immediately. He looked at his son and said their personal desires were no longer the focus. William had asked about certainty. Charles had answered about duty. Those are not the same thing, and that may be the clearest sign of how conflicted this decision actually was. Later, Camilla confronted William in a private sitting room. She asked if he truly believed she had tried to prevent his accession. William didn't answer immediately. Then he told her that wasn't what bothered him. What bothered him was that she had tried to stop Charles from making a decision his father believed was necessary. That distinction changed the entire conflict. It wasn't simply about William wanting power. It was about Camilla trying to control Charles's ability to let go. William reportedly told her, "There's a difference between protecting someone and managing their ability to release something." That line struck at the heart of the dispute. Camilla had convinced herself she was defending Charles, but William believed she was actually trying to preserve her own wishes. Then Camilla revealed something even more. She asked whether Catherine's growing role had influenced the speed of the transition. William was reportedly surprised. He told her Catherine had no knowledge of the final date. She hadn't coordinated with Charles. She hadn't pushed the schedule. That destroyed one of Camilla's deepest suspicions. She had been looking for someone to blame. Catherine, William, ambitious advisors. But the truth was much simpler. Charles had made the decision himself, without her input. And that was the part she couldn't recover from. Camilla had spent decades watching Charles wait for the throne. She knew how much that identity meant to him. She assumed he would never voluntarily release it. So when he did, and did it without telling her, the foundation of her understanding collapsed. This wasn't only a constitutional problem, it was a marriage problem. And yet the palace machinery continued moving. By the next morning, William's office was already handling sovereign duties. Briefings were rerouted. Ceremonial approvals went to him. Decisions that previously waited for Charles's final word now required William's direct consent. Camilla felt the change immediately. She arrived for a schedule briefing and discovered it had been removed from her diary. Her secretary explained that William's approval was now required. She stared at the empty time slot, closed the diary, and asked to be left alone. That small administrative change hit harder than the announcement, because it proved the power had already moved. No speech was necessary. The calendar had changed. Charles understood what was happening to her. He understood the loneliness, but he refused to intervene. He knew that stepping in on the first day would undermine William before the new reign had even begun. So he offered Camilla comfort privately, while refusing to restore what had changed publicly. William, however, did something unexpected. He instructed senior staff that Camilla should not be humiliated. Her personal team shouldn't be stripped away carelessly. The transition shouldn't become an excuse for retaliation. That order mattered, because it separated institutional reform from personal punishment. William wanted a clean transition, not a vengeful one. When Camilla heard about the order, she was reportedly surprised. She had expected restrictions, maybe even payback. Instead, William protected her dignity while reducing her influence. That's a very specific kind of power, controlled, deliberate. And it forced Camilla to reconsider whether she had completely misunderstood his intentions. Then William requested a private meeting with her. No secretaries, no advisors, no official documents, just the two of them. And this is where the story becomes emotional. William told her that becoming king didn't feel like a victory. It felt like watching a piece of Charles disappear, while everyone else expected him to celebrate. He had spent his entire life preparing for the throne, but he had never stood beside his father while power passed from one generation to the next. And that's why it hurt. One man's accession came from another man's resignation. Camilla listened, and for the first time, she didn't argue about protocol. She didn't defend the schedule. She admitted that fear had driven her resistance. She was afraid of what would happen to Charles once he released the identity that had defined him for decades. She had watched him wait so long. Letting go so soon felt like watching him lose himself. William didn't interrupt. He let her speak. Then he told her something she didn't expect. He wasn't going to erase her place beside Charles. Her formal influence would change because the structure around the crown had changed. But her personal relationship with his father wasn't something royal authority could simply end. He wanted a transition that was firm but not cruel. And that's the part that complicates the simple villain story. Yes, Camilla tried to delay the inevitable. Yes, she positioned herself against William's rise. But when the moment came, William didn't destroy her. He drew a boundary around her humanity. And Camilla finally admitted that trying to postpone the transfer might have gone too far. She acknowledged that what began as defending Charles had slowly become opposition to a future she was personally afraid of. It wasn't only about power, it was about fear. Fear of irrelevance, fear of losing the person she loved to a role that would consume him, fear of becoming a footnote in a story she had fought to be part of. Outside the palace, the public narrative was already changing. Broadcasters framed it as a remarkable generational shift. Commentators focused on Charles stepping back and William taking control. The palace released a carefully worded statement emphasizing continuity, family unity, and respect for the former monarch. But the language was careful because the reality was still raw. The family was emotionally catching up to something that had already been legally completed. Charles barely watched the coverage. He heard people discussing his departure, turned off the broadcast, and asked about William's first official schedule. That detail says everything. He wasn't worried about his reputation, he was worried about his son. The role had changed. The concern hadn't. William also struggled with the public celebration. Crowds gathered outside Buckingham Palace, chanting his name. Newspapers announced William as king. But beneath the celebration were images of Charles leaving his final meeting as sovereign. Celebration and grief appeared on the same front page. William understood the imbalance. He knew what Charles had given up. And the applause felt disconnected from the personal cost. Catherine reminded him that he didn't have to pretend the day had been painless. He could honor his father's sacrifice without flinching from the duty now placed on him. Camilla also began adjusting her public stance. She would continue supporting Charles personally even as her institutional influence changed. She wasn't erased, she was repositioned. And that distinction mattered. Then came one of the most emotional moments. Before William's first major public appearance, Charles met with him privately. He adjusted his son's jacket, stepped back, and told him he no longer needed permission to lead. William didn't say anything. He simply hugged his father. For a moment, the relationship mattered more than the crown. Two men standing in a room, one releasing what the other was now carrying. The transfer was complete. Not because of a signature, not because of a proclamation, but because Charles chose to let go, and William chose to accept it without pretending it was easy. Camilla joined Charles afterward. There were no officials, no advisors. She admitted that her collapse hadn't only been about losing influence. It was the realization that the life they had known had ended in a single sentence. She was afraid of what would remain after the old structure disappeared. Charles took her hand and told her they wouldn't lose their shared life simply because they had lost the crown. Whether she completely believed him is another question, but in that moment, it was enough. William kept his earlier promise. Camilla's institutional power was reduced, but she wasn't degraded, isolated, or treated as an enemy. Catherine stood beside the new monarch. Charles stepped back voluntarily, and the transfer was completed not through defeat, but through deliberate surrender from one generation and acceptance from the next. That's the part the dramatic headlines miss. This wasn't simply a coup. It wasn't simply a betrayal. It was a man deciding that the monarchy needed certainty more than it needed his continued grip on the throne. And it was the people around him reacting to that decision in very human ways. Camilla collapsed because she realized she had been excluded from the most consequential choice of Charles's reign. William hesitated because he understood the cost of what he was receiving. Charles stayed silent because he had already made peace with the loss. And the palace moved forward because institutions don't wait for emotions to catch up. The machinery doesn't care who's crying in private rooms. It needs the next signature, the next briefing, the next approval. So when you step back and look at the whole story, it's not really about the Privy Council handing William a title. It's about what that title cost everyone in the room. Charles lost the role that defined him. Camilla lost the access she had built her position around. William gained a crown and immediately felt its weight pressing down on his relationship with his father. The title was official, the power was real, but the emotional fallout continued long after the cameras left, and that's why the timeline matters. The signature dated days earlier, the private meeting at Windsor, the argument Camilla thought she could still win, the announcement she never saw coming. None of it was accidental. Charles had already chosen, he simply hadn't told the people closest to him. That's the contradiction at the center of the story. The palace can present a smooth handover, but the people involved are still dealing with the emotional cost. William is king. Charles is no longer sovereign. Camilla is still standing, but the ground beneath her has shifted permanently. And the only thing that's certain now is that this transition was never as simple as the official statement made it look. The crown moved. The family is still catching up. And the silence from those private rooms is louder than any proclamation.